Hello everyone, you're watching Free Russia Forum channel. I am Danil Konstantinov and we start our stream. It's called Strikes on Moscow, the beginning of the end, question mark. So what this topic is about? It is what we're going to discuss today with our today's guest, historian Yuri Felshtinsky, an author of several very interesting books, and one of his latest books is From the Red Terror to the Mafia State, and I very much recommend this book to read. In this book, he talks about the history of Russia from the 20th and 21st century. Our topic today is about what's happening. Hello, Yuri. Hello. Our topic today is about Yuri Felshtinsky's concept. I remember that you, Yuri, many times stated that this war of Ukraine is impossible without Ukrainian strikes on Russian Federation or Belarus. And Belarus might be a bridgehead for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it seems that it's happening now, strikes on Russia. We know about the raids of Russian volunteer corps to Belgorod region. We see often the strikes of drones on Russian territory, and yesterday it seemed to be the most powerful strike of drones on the Moscow region, and Moscow, at least what we know, Ukrainian leadership doesn't say that this is them who did it, but it seems that it's them. So here's a question. Do you think it's a sufficient condition for the victory to be won, or there must be more serious strikes or offensives? And can we call this the beginning of the end of Putin's regime? I think that the victory in this war will be determined by two important points. One of them is strategic. This is liberation of occupied Belarus, because at this point, when Putin loses Belarus, he will lose it as a very important bridgehead, and a bridgehead to launch a nuclear strike on Europe from Belarus, and as a bridgehead for a new offensive on Kiev from Belarus. And yes, quite a while ago, I used to state that despite the fact that Russia is a big country, but this is a country of one city, where everything is determined by Moscow. So it is important to launch strikes on Moscow. Otherwise, Russia will never see this war and will never feel it. Let's say that the attack that was just happened was the attack of Ukrainian military forces, yet we don't have enough information what forces were involved in this attack on the side of Ukraine and on the side of Russia, if we talk about air defense systems. I would say that this attack was not a success for Ukrainians, because it didn't look that the targets that were marked, or were supposed to marked as military sites, military facilities in Moscow, were actually destroyed. But again, I'm not an expert, military expert, and I can't really give you any expertise on how technically and if it was done properly. But it seems that the targets that could have been marked for this strike were not destroyed, or we don't know about it yet, which is also possible. Now, nevertheless, the trend is correct, right? What do you think? Oh, yes, absolutely. Long ago, I said, and I insist on it, that the victory in this war is determined by 2 points: pushing Russia out of Belarus and dethroning Lukashenko and restoring democracy in Belarus and launching strikes on Moscow, because on the south and on the east they have positional war. And again, I'm not a military expert, I'm a historian. I know the history of the First World War and the Second World War, but this is the limits of my expertise. Though it seems to me that we should not expect fast and successful breakthroughs in the south and the east areas, because I think that the counteroffensive that is done now or will be done very soon in the near future, and I don't think it will be determining the outcome of the war. This is how it seems to me. I don't quite understand how it is possible to quickly push out Russian occupants from Donbass, from Crimea, because in Crimea they concentrate quite significant forces, and Donbass, the territory they've been fighting over since 2014, clearly that these territories will be significantly destroyed as a result of the warfare. But due to all these reasons, I don't see a possibility of a quick front attack and throwing Russian military forces to the Black Sea and removing them from Crimea and pushing them out of Donbass. I think that this positional war will take some time in those regions. On the other hand, when Russia loses Belarus and Moscow, that will be from time to time struck by drones and missiles. So this war on the South Front will be useless war for Russia. The fights where Russia loses a lot of human forces, and I understand that Putin doesn't give a damn about it, and they throw prisoners to these fronts from Wagner private military company, but nevertheless Russia loses much more people, many more people than Ukraine. Clearly, Ukraine is many times smaller than Russia, and to some degree these losses for Ukraine are a bit more painful than for Russia. But again, I repeat myself that on the south and the east directions, Russia cannot move anywhere and it cannot do anything for quite a while, but it doesn't mean that Ukraine will be able to quickly push out Russia from those territories, because Russia managed to root in those territories. We have quite an interesting and original concept of this war. You say things that others don't say, and oftentimes you say things that go against other experts. And I would agree with you that for Ukraine it will be very difficult to fight on the south and the east directions, because Russian troops, they trenched in those areas and concentrated quite significant forces there. But talking about your plan of hypothetical victory of Ukraine, and I have several questions about it. So you say to launch strikes on Moscow, but here we all are in sort of psychological trap, because all of us, we have many friends in Moscow, families, acquaintances. And in fact, many of those friends, they don't support Putin or the war. So all these strikes could be on them. So what to do with it? Do you have an answer to this question? Yes, of course. I have an answer. I'm sure that Thomas Mann, back then in Germany, had many friends during World War II, and this is my answer to your question. We know that many of our friends and family and acquaintances, they left Russia. And many of them left Moscow. We know that. The war has been going on for 15 months, and it's not news for Muscovites. And those Muscovites who are our friends and family, and those Muscovites who do not support the war. I'm sure that these people exist. Let's not pretend that we are talking about Berlin of 1945 and those carpet bombings. We're not talking about it. Here we're talking about strikes on military facilities, governmental buildings like Lubyanka, KGB building, Ostankino, TV tower, Ministry of Defense, the government house, State Duma building, and there are many military facilities like that in Moscow today. So, therefore, if Ukrainian military forces, they will have this capability to launch strikes on those sites and facilities, Russia will feel this war. If Ukrainians don't have this chance, Russia will never feel this war. Because so far people go to theaters in Moscow, they go to movies, they go to restaurants, and they have this peaceful sky above them. While Kiev is bombed quite regularly. So that's why there is nothing unnatural or wrong to launch strikes on the capital of the aggressor state, of the adversary state. And that should be one of the main goals for the Ukrainian military forces, and I think they have this goal. It's just quite hard to achieve this goal, because if they're trying to achieve this goal with all those restrictions that were imposed on Ukraine by its Western allies, and the restrictions are that Ukraine cannot use Western weapons to launch strikes on the Russian Federation and Belarus, then of course that reduces the efficiency of airstrikes of the Ukraine military forces on Moscow. One of the targets you said is Ostankino TV tower. This district, this is where I grew up, and I just imagine what it could be. But anyway, back to the next part of your plan. You said that one of the elements of this plan is to deoccupation of Belarus. In other words, that's going to be a military operation of Ukraine to dismantle Lukashenko's regime and pushing out Russia's army from that country. Do you understand it correctly? Well, let me clarify that a little bit, that today in Ukraine there are Belarus volunteers who fight on Ukraine's side against Russian occupants. And here we are talking about organizing a division of Belarus volunteers based on those military regiments of Belarus that already exist in Ukraine, is Kalinovsky's regiment that exists already within the Ukrainian military forces. But it can be and must be only the decision of Ukrainians. It's very important to understand that, because no actions to make a brigade or a division of Belarus volunteers, it is impossible to do without the support of Ukrainian military forces. And an ideal option would be here to form a division of Belarus army in Ukraine that will start liberation of Belarus from Russian occupation and from Lukashenko's regime. Ideally, yes, that would be the case. And I personally think it would be right that this operation would be done openly, with support of the Ukrainian military forces on the one hand, and with the support of NATO forces on the other hand, at least political support of NATO. Since Putin has this intention to place nuclear weapons in Belarus, now there is a threat directly for all Europe, because using Belarus they can launch a nuclear strike on Europe. And since I think that this risk is extremely high, I think that in this case NATO has to prevent it. Because again, as soon as Belarus has nuclear weapons, chances for this war to grow into a nuclear war are way too high. And I think to let it happen would be extremely stupid and irresponsible if you're talking about NATO leadership and political leadership of the EU. Because we know what efforts were made to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons over the years. And we know that the whole world is concerned with this problem, particularly the United States and Europe. And now what Putin organizes in Belarus today is actually way more dangerous than making nuclear weapons in Iran. Way more dangerous, because the strikes are declared already. And Lukashenko many times said that from Belarus they will launch nuclear strikes. For some reason he says there will be Poland and Lithuania the targets of those strikes. Why Poland and Lithuania, I don't know, but many times Lukashenko said it's going to be Lithuania and Poland. So therefore, three countries, Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine, are in very serious risk zone. And at least these three states, but in fact the whole Europe, should be very much concerned, and they should prevent this from happening. And I think the best preventive measure would be to deoccupy Belarus while Belarus doesn't have nuclear weapons yet, and to dethrone Lukashenko regime, the regime that lost its legitimacy back in 2020, and restoring democracy in Belarus. And there are all the prerequisites for that. And I think this operation could be done quite quickly and bloodlessly. And again, I'm saying it should be done while Belarus doesn't have nuclear weapons. But as soon as they have Iskander missiles with nuclear warheads, because the missiles are already there, but they are not equipped with nuclear warheads. But as soon as they have first Belarus Su-25 jets to carry those missiles, Putin will transfer strategic nuclear weapons to Belarus, and he'll put the whole Europe in front of the threat of nuclear catastrophe. This is his plan. And to pretend that this is not the case, I think it's extremely naive and stupid. And I think it's a destructive policy, I'd say. I think it's a real light-headed look at what we know already about Putin, about his FSB cronies and Russia and Russia's state today. I think it is a global threat of the world and Europe in particular. And I think the most painless solution of this problem will be an immediate invasion in Belarus and dethroning Russia from there, like pushing Russia from there and destroying this buffer bridgehead. Because think about it, it's not incidental that Putin didn't annex Belarus, and he did not unite Belarus and Russia and just kept it just like two separate states. He did it for one goal only: to keep Belarus as an independent state, to be able to make nuclear strikes from Belarus, so that the response to that strike would be on Belarus, not Russia. And this is a military operation, and this military operation is taking place right now. And if we are not going, I'm saying we, of course we can't do much, we're sitting here in the studio and talking. But if European leaders and the United States don't do anything to resolve this issue, we will be witnessing a nuclear strike on Europe. And many times we already encountered this hybrid military moves of Putin when he was saying we are not there, this like polite green people in Crimea and all that kind of things. Yes, of course we are supposed to expect some sort of hybrid military moves. And I think that I approximately understand how it's going to be done. Nuclear weapons that will be delivered to Belarus. Next day it will be stolen by some Ukrainian terrorists. They'll show us some Ukrainian passports of these people, and they will be some Ukrainian citizens from eastern Ukraine, from Donbass, from Crimea. There will be pilots who will fly those jets. There will be operators of these Iskander missiles, and they will launch those missiles. And after that, they'll tell us that all that was done by Ukrainian terrorists from Ukrainian military forces in order to provoke conflict between Russia and the United States, Russia and Europe. It will be a long investigation, as it was with the surface-to-air missile system that destroyed MH17. Who were those operators of Iskander missiles and Su-25? Or maybe they'll come up with some other hybrid moves to do that. There are many experts on this in Moscow. Yuri, you really scare me with all these scenarios. 10 minutes ago, I actually would like to argue with you about the possibility of such a strike and consequences of it, but right now, the whole picture looks to me more precise. Actually, I never thought about such possibilities that you were talking about those hybrid technologies of using nuclear weapons. I actually didn't think about it. But see, this is my expertise, my profession. What I do, I study Russia. all my life. Heroes of my books, they're all very bad people. Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Putin, they're all very bad people. And this is the bad people I've been studying all my life. And I think that my assessment is right. My assessment of explosions of the buildings in Moscow was right, and together with Litvinenko, we were the only people who thought so for some time, as the time showed that our assessment was right. My assessment of 2014, when I said that Russia will begin a big war with Ukraine, it turned out to be right too. Let's put it this way. The fact that only I who says these things, it doesn't mean that I'm wrong. Actually, I will be very happy to be wrong, and I would like to underline it sincerely. More than anything else, I want to be wrong. But actually, the same happened in February of 2022, when I sincerely wanted to be wrong in my confidence that Russia will begin a full-scale war against Ukraine, and I was talking about it, and I was in minority saying all this, because the majority of people and quite serious analysts, they were insisting that it will never happen because it's all bluff, it's blackmail, and it's just impossible. So the scenario that I'm presenting here, it does look quite dire. But if the United States and NATO don't find a way to resolve this problem, and if we will be witnessing how nuclear weapons delivered to Belarus, because maybe somewhere backstage there is some sort of fight, maybe the United States is trying to prevent the transportation of nuclear weapons to Belarus, and it's right, and it should be done. Maybe all the efforts are focused on this, I don't know. But if we witness that these weapons are in Belarus, then trust me, these nuclear weapons will be used.
Даже немножко у меня идет как бы мой план эфира коту под хвост, потому что
my agenda of today's broadcast is kind of totally destroyed, and because very important topics we're discussing now, and we should talk about them in more detail. When I was about to argue with you about using nuclear weapons from the territory of Belarus, I was thinking that the state officially will be using nuclear weapons, and since the state that is giving this nuclear weapon to Belarus is the Russian Federation, and Russia has all the keys from these weapons, so it would be useless to launch a response strike on Belarus, because everybody would know that it would have been done by Russia. But everything that you talked about and put in your scenario, don't you think that everybody would be clear that this is another special nuclear operation of Putin, and it's not some sort of Ukrainian terrorists, as they might say? In 2008, maybe it wasn't clear for everyone that it was a Russian army that was invading Georgia, and that it was Russian army that was starting a war there. Maybe some people understood it, maybe some people didn't, but everybody pretended that they don't understand. And there were no consequences of Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. In 2014, I don't know whether everybody understood that this is a Russian army that invades Ukraine, but for some reason, people pretended that it wasn't Russian army So when it was in Donbass, everybody could pretend there were some volunteers, some insurgents, some partisans, whatnot. But about Crimea, everybody kind of pretended maybe Crimea is a Russian peninsula since Russia took it over so quickly and without any losses and all that. But the most amazing thing is that back in 2014, the Ukrainian government did not look at those events as the beginning of military actions and war, and they kind of didn't understand that it was a war waged against Ukraine, and they didn't stop their diplomatic relationships with Russia. And Georgia in 2008 actually stopped its diplomatic relationships with Russia. I am saying this because, like, whoever understands what, it's actually quite a philosophical kind of a kitchen talk, as they say, a dinner talk. And it doesn't have to do anything with all those military decisions. I guarantee that in case of a nuclear strike is launched from Belarus, and despite the fact that everybody understands that Russia is behind it, they will respond and launch a counter-nuclear strike on Belarus. So nobody will start a nuclear conflict with Russia when the nuclear strike is launched from Belarus. This is what Putin understands very well, and this is the calculation that he made, and it's really so. Nobody is going to launch a nuclear strike on Russia in this case. If the Russian leadership thought that in case of a nuclear strike from Belarus will cause a counter-nuclear strike on Russia anyway, so all those Iskander missiles and Su-25 bombers wouldn't be transported to Belarus. All these could be transported to Kaliningrad region that is strategically located quite close to Europe, and actually much more dangerous for Europe than Belarus, and they would launch this nuclear strike from Kaliningrad region on any European country. While in Belarus, all these nuclear strikes with tactical nuclear weapons could be launched only on nearby countries. So that's why Belarus was chosen by Putin on purpose, and he kept it independent on purpose exactly for this opportunity. When the Russian army invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, and when the attack wasn't developing as successful as they expected, we were discussing whether Putin had plan B. So this is plan B of Putin. So now it's clear what the plan B was. And since plan B existed from the very beginning, we also have, if not a proof, but at least some indication of it. Lukashenko removed Belarus from non-nuclear status at the end of February of 2022. In other words, several days after the war began, he did that, when it was clear that Ukraine is going to surrender as they expected, and Ukraine begins to resist. And at that point, it was clear that they're preparing Plan B. And now we're witnessing how this Plan B is implemented. So if war in Ukraine takes too long, and for some reasons Russia can't take over Ukraine quickly, then Plan B will be executed. So we move nuclear weapons to Belarus, and we launch a nuclear strike on Europe from Belarus. And we'll see what's going to happen, whether Europe will capitulate or not, because Putin still has this idea that all that should be done is to scare them, a lot, and then they'll surrender. And he's still confident about it. He thought that he'll scare Ukraine and Ukraine will surrender. Then he thought that he'd scare Europe and Europe wouldn't help Ukraine. And now he thinks that to scare Europe for real, he needs to launch a nuclear strike from Belarus, then everybody will be really scared and everybody will surrender. Because do you remember how they called the last interview with Patrushev, the Secretary of Security Council? He said, they are not scared at all. So this is KGB mentality. And for Western politicians, it's very hard to understand. And the idea of this mentality is that they need just to scare and beat and maybe kill when it's needed. So that's it. Everything is pretty simple and pretty obvious. There is nothing unnatural for these FSB people and Putin included. This is just their regular approach. They've been living like this all their lives, on these principles. They always knew that if you hit someone, the person surrenders, and if they didn't surrender, then you need to hit them harder. And if they didn't surrender still, then just kill them. So, and the same has to do with countries they want to occupy. Yuri, everything you say is very convincing and quite smooth, but there is one variable that is out of it. So it's Lukashenko. Why would he need that? Oh, nobody asks him. Well, actually, there is no any Lukashenko anymore. So there is this man who kind of walks around and says something. And sometimes he says just total nonsense. Something like they will transport nuclear weapons to Kazakhstan. Or maybe they do, but it's kind of different continent, so to speak. Because this option will have to be discussed with China. So I don't think that they will transport nuclear weapons to Kazakhstan. See, Lukashenko is a dictator. He lost some legitimacy that he still had by 2020, and he lost it completely in 2020. And he knows that his power is supported only by Russia, and he knows that Russia at any point can assassinate him and replace him with anybody. And I'm sure that a candidate is prepared, and this candidate will do whatever Russia says, just as good as Lukashenko. And I think Lukashenko understands it very well. It looks like his health is not doing very well. It doesn't mean he'll die tomorrow. We know that sick people can live for a while, so that's why I would count on it. But let's be frank, it would be a good news. So nobody's going to ask him about this scenario of events. Well, see, he's not asked. Many people, and I in particular, we spoke in your broadcasts, and we said that what Putin does is absolutely destructive for Russia, no matter what your point of view is. What Putin has done to Russia is absolutely destructive for Russia. And what Lukashenko has done to Belarus, it's not even destructive, it's suicidal for Belarus. Because if they'll launch a nuclear strike from Belarus, Belarus will be obliterated from the face of the earth. There won't be any building standing. Human losses will be massive. And what Putin does with Belarus and what Lukashenko signed off, this is an unheard of provocation. And thus Putin frames the whole country with all this many million population. And if Lukashenko signs it, approves of it, and Lukashenko doesn't have any problems with it, and in Russia and Belarus, nobody raised this question, wait a second, we're gonna get these nuclear weapons. We'll strike our enemies, whether it's Poland or Lithuania. But what about the counter-nuclear strike? Are they going to strike us back? And if they strike us back, so what consequences will be? And that's quite astonishing that nobody asks this question in Belarus. Nobody in the government, nobody in the military, nobody in media. There is no propaganda people who would ask this question, which tells us that Belarusians have no say in the decision-making process. In other words, what's going to be done or what's not going to be done, what will be done from the Belarusian territory or what not. That's just the fate of Belarusians. And no one cares about this fate. But they will be under the strike. Therefore, when we discuss the role of Lukashenko and his influence, it's kind of useless, because either this influence is zero, or we look at Lukashenko as just an absolute enemy of the state, a traitor of the Belarusian people. I do understand how dictatorship works, Putin's dictatorship, Stalin's dictatorship, or Lukashenko's. I just sincerely don't understand why in Belarus there is no anybody in military or in special forces. They don't have this doubt. It's kind of, wait a second. Okay, fine, so we'll launch a strike on Europe, but what's going to happen to us? They'll just annihilate us, all of us. Wives, children, lovers. On the other hand, let's not forget the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they didn't have a lot of doubt while Khrushchev was deploying nuclear weapons in Cuba. For some reason, nobody was asking these questions to themselves, and if they did, so we don't know anything about it. Well, actually, it's a very good example with the Cuban Missile Crisis. First of all, in 1968, the Soviet government was trying to deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba as part of their covert operation, and they did it accordingly. So they secretly built some silos for missiles. They were transporting missiles and nuclear weapons to Cuba until Americans actually saw it, they exposed it, and it was a big scandal, and as a result, the Soviet government aborted those plans. But see, in Belarus, everything is done openly. Why did Putin have to announce that by July 1st they'll build all those storages and silos? Why he did that? Was anybody, kind of, as they say, pulling his tongue to say that? Somebody was asking for this information. Why they signed all these documents between these two ministers of defense, Shoigu from Russia and Belarus minister, so the rules of storing nuclear weapons and use of nuclear weapons, why they're doing it openly? The goal is one, because so that everybody would know that on that date nuclear weapons will be transported to Belarus, because then they'll have to make a legend that these nuclear weapons, in my version, is stolen by Ukrainian insurgents, and in Putin's mind it can be somebody else, they can make up something else. Yes, these weapons will be stolen, and then it will be launched at some point. So this is a reason why it's happening openly, because yes, everybody should know that Russia delivered nuclear weapons to Belarus as part of cooperation of Belarus and Russia, that Russia controls nuclear weapons, so which means it is not breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1995, but actually when these nuclear weapons will be already on Belarus Iskander missiles and on Belarus Su-25 bombers that were equipped in Russia, so that nuclear weapons could be put on this. So at this point, this is the breach of the Treaty of 1995, because then the nuclear weapons are in disposal of Belarus leadership. But trust me, that breaching this formal treaty, that's like the least problem that we should be concerned about. In fact, it's not the first treaty that Russia is going to breach as part of this ongoing war. So I think it's a formal issue and it's quite insignificant. Okay, I suggest that we'll put off this topic for a little bit and we'll get back to it later. Yuri, you're talking about Belarus. It can be liberated using Kalinovsky regiments, creating Belarus Liberation Army or a division that will go to Belarus supported by Ukrainian military forces, and using opposition in Belarus, they'll dethrone Lukashenko and push out Russian forces. But we also know that there is Russian volunteer corps and they fight against Putin's army as part of Ukrainian military forces. Why not to make a Russian Liberation Army and using the same model like they made this raid to Belgorod region? So why not to create this army, Russian Liberation Army, and send it to Russia? No, it's not simpler. Russia is a huge country with lots of resources, with big army and with nuclear weapons that Russia can use in case of aggression against Russia on Russia's territory. Why on Russia's territory? No. Well, let's say formally. So Russian Liberation Army invades Russia. They come with this new flag. In Kiev they say it's not us who are doing this, and this army goes to Moscow. Wait a second. See? We don't see any indication that 90% of Russian population, they are against this war, against Putin, against his regime, and they're dreaming about dethroning this regime. In fact, on the contrary, we have quite big statistics that a majority of Russian population either supports the war in Ukraine or at least indifferent to it. But with Belarus, it's completely different. We have quite solid data that tells us that regime of Lukashenko is not supported by the people. We saw it in 2020. We know that there is serious opposition in Belarus, that is in Belarus and abroad, and we know it because there is this Tikhanovskaya government abroad. It's a completely different story, and let alone the size of the country. Russian Federation and Belarus, they're incomparable. Liberation of Belarus could be done bloodlessly and quickly. With the Russian Federation, I would be more cautious. I don't think that any Russian liberation forces will help, let alone that they get to Moscow. I don't think it's possible. And in this case, I would actually form an international brigade and using Belarus volunteers in Ukraine, and again, to dethrone Lukashenko's regime. This could be done like that if the Ukrainian leadership doesn't want to engage Ukrainian military forces at this stage of invading Belarus. Okay, logic is clear. And I'd say that I agree with you, at least at this point. Prigozhin, this head of the private military company Wagner, after yesterday's drone strikes on Moscow, he kind of opened up more, and he said that they should launch a full mobilization in Russia, and many people said that before, but I think for the first time this proposal was announced by him yesterday. So do you think it could be realized like that, this full-scale mobilization? I think that all Russian mobilization was proposed by Girkin before, that the whole country should be working for the war and this war economy and all that. If we look at the history of World War II and how the Soviet Union mobilized its resources fighting against Germany, this is what was done back then. I would like to underline one important thing here. Prigozhin is Putin's project. This should be understood. He doesn't say a word independently. He may make an impression of a person with a complicated background, being a prisoner before, and he's probably independent, and he doesn't have to do anything with official Russian bodies. But in fact, Prigozhin is Putin's project, and Prigozhin is a business project. Everything that Prigozhin does, this is his business project. And taking into account these two elements, we can analyze what Prigozhin is saying. Can Russia do a total mobilization? Probably it can. But clearly, a total mobilization will significantly hit the economy of the state. And how important the economy of the state is important to run the war, I don't know. I'm not an economist, and I don't know how mobilization will impact the economy of the country, and will it be useful for the warfare, or it will be bad for it. We can assume that Russian army could be increased significantly, and this armada will attack Ukraine and will flood Ukraine and destroy Ukraine. But frankly, I don't quite see this scenario to be implemented. Nevertheless, I think that this war will not be limited with Ukraine, and Putin, if he wins a victory over Ukraine and taking over the Ukraine, and he'll go further. I think that his program that he started is much broader, and the goals that they initially had didn't go anywhere, didn't change at all. Putin planned to take over Europe at the beginning, and he still has that, and it's part of his strategic plans. The plans didn't change after February 24. It's surprising, probably, but it's true. Let's step a little bit aside from the mainstream of our talk, and I would like to ask a clarifying question that actually has to do with your concept. Many times you said in your publications and the books, and you actually repeat it now, that the main goal of the Russian security agency, KGB, this monster that you describe in your books, their main goal was always world supremacy. So here's the question then, why? What for do they need this world supremacy? It's a very complicated question, it's a kind of philosophical question, because in fact it's sort of a modified concept of world revolution that the communists had in 1917-1918, when this program was realized. And as they thought, the program was quite successful, but then at some point it kind of took a different shape and form, and Stalin was implementing the same program but differently, not relying on revolutionary movements in different countries, but relying more on military invasions and taking over different countries one after another. That's why what Putin does today, in some way, this is the continuation of what started back in 1917. And then what we saw in 1939 and 1940, when Stalin continued the same program of taking over countries. Then the Soviet government continued the same program, also a bit modified when they were expanding the so-called socialist camp. They showed this map in the Soviet Union when slowly more and more countries were covered with red color. So this is really a continuation of the old program, though using different methods. Putin, or say the security agency, in 1991, they rejected ideology. That was the idea. That was back then, so Communist Party didn't have the monopoly on power anymore, and the state security agencies thought that all the problems they had were because the Communist Party is very much restricted with its dogmas. In order to win, they need to free themselves from these ideological dogmas. They hold them back. They don't help them. And look how well Putin uses people from the left, people from the right, anti-Americans, pacifists, militarists. He uses the ones that he needs without any ideological restrictions. It unties his hands, and he has a broader front of allies, so to speak. And in this sense, Putin didn't come up with anything new. It's just a bit different, because where Trotsky had this idea of international revolution with a red flag, or where Stalin had this idea to conquer the world with a Soviet flag, Putin's idea is to conquer the world with the flag of Russian Federation and recreating some sort of empire, whether it's Soviet, whether it's Russian, some empire. But in any case, here we're talking about the territorial expansion, taking over new territories. Recently, I listened again Putin's Munich speech, and it's a very interesting one. It's quite interesting how he's trying to attribute these plans of conquering the world. He attributes them to the United States, but in fact, he is describing his own plans. Just forget about it. Once in his speech, he mentioned the United States, that this is what the United States want. But in fact, this is Putin's program of conquering the world. This is exactly exactly what he wants. He described the whole thing, but he just attributed this desire to the United States, which is, by the way, he does it quite often, he attributes his own intentions to his adversaries. Say something like this: the United States will be fighting in Ukraine till the last Ukrainian. But in fact, this is his plan to fight in Ukraine until he will annihilate all Ukrainians. I think there is something Freudian in this, but it's typical for Putin, attributing his own plans to his adversary. So that's why there is nothing unnatural in Putin's intentions to take over control over the world. It might seem like a schizophrenic idea and something that's hard to be done, but it may seem to us. Many people back in 1917 thought that this world communist revolution is idiotic and crazy, and this plan of the Soviet Union to conquer the world were utopian or idiotic. And every time it turned out that they were utopian or idiotic. And now we can say probably the same about Putin's plan. They're either utopian or idiotic. But sadly, every time all these attempts, whether it's Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, they're like trying to realize a fairy tale. As they say, we are born to make a fairy tale reality. So when we actually pay a lot, the cost of this realization of fairy tales is quite high. Quite an interesting picture, though I still don't quite understand. If, in case of Bolsheviks, I understand why they needed this world supremacy, this is idea of world communism, but in case of today's non-ideological KGB intentions, I don't quite understand why they need this world supremacy. You can explain it that yes, they want to recreate this empire as form of the state, as to have this like territorial supremacy, so to speak, right? See, an empire is an ideological sort of frame of it, frame of practical goals they have. And many people thought that when we studied Stalin, they thought that Stalin was using communist ideology only to justify this territorial annexation. And he was a dictator, and there's no doubt about it. And he wanted to conquer the whole world, and the communist ideology was a good tool to do that. Back in 1943, Stalin dissolved the Communist International Movement, Comintern, because he thought it's not beneficial for him anymore. Here we're talking about territorial takeover. Anyway, we may make fun of it, but right now FSB is putting border markers in the North Pole, in permafrost, where there is no living thing, a living human being, except for polar bears, maybe. But right now they're putting their border markers, and they put their border posts with border control. you may think that they're crazy, but they think tomorrow the snow will melt and there will be land there and there are going to be a lot of natural resources, gold and diamonds and whatever. And they say, okay, last century we put there the border markers, so this is our territory. We were just waiting for the snow to melt. Now it melted, so it's our territory now. That's what they're going to say. And by the way, in the context of global warming, it may be not as funny, right? Yes, of course, I'm sure in FSB they wrote a lot of reports on that. Kind of long-term scenarios, short-term scenario, and they would say, so right now we just put there the border markers. So I think that Putin, this collective Putin, he is looking at the future of Russia from the point of view of territorial expansion and territorial takeovers. It may be stupid, it may be very trivial, it should be all gone back in 19th century. People shouldn't be thinking this way, or at least by 1945 these ideas should be completely abandoned. But it turned out they're not. So they've been thinking in these concepts of territorial takeover, and they didn't stop. So we shouldn't be surprised with their idea of restoring the Soviet Union. They announced it. They wanted to restore the influence of Soviet Union that it had in Eastern Europe. So they announced it, and they were doing it. So the plan is actually described for us. But going back to what we're talking about, this plan will be realized, or attempt to realize this plan will be done through using the nuclear weapons. And I would be quite cautious not taking it into account. Look at the person who is running Russia today, and I repeat, he's not alone. There are many like him around him. They've been selecting them for 20 years for this war, and they want to be part of the history like those who were not afraid of using nuclear weapons. And it's quite easy to imagine. I understand it's a scary scenario, and that's why for people it's very difficult to imagine it. Just it's a psychological problem. We don't want to believe in the scary scenarios. But listen, German Jews, the least they could imagine that they will be burned in the chambers, in the gas chambers. They couldn't imagine that they will be put to death like that. But nevertheless, this is what happened. But the fact that potential victim cannot imagine the scale of the threat, it doesn't mean that this victim is preventing this threat by not taking it into account. Another question that we had in our agenda, and it actually relates to what you said, if Putin decides in one way or another, open, covert, or hybrid, he decides to attack one of the NATO countries, what Turkey would do, run by Erdogan, who is back in power after the election. On the one hand, Turkey is part of NATO, but on the other hand, there is this policy of Erdogan. Will he join the anti-Putin coalition? Here we're not talking about anti-Putin coalition. I would like to underline that. We're talking about the nuclear strike from Belarus, and we're talking about the counter-strike on Belarus, so Erdogan has nothing to do with it. There are no military forces in Belarus, there are no Russian military forces in Belarus, because all of them are engaged in the war against Ukraine. Belarus army is very small, maybe 20 to 40,000 troops, and it's not clear how many of them are actually capable of fighting, and it's not clear if they're going to fight and protect Lukashenko. I actually doubt it. Life tells us that these classical dictatorships, they actually fall like a house of cards. Nobody protects dictators ever. So I think that Belarus today could be taken over with bare hands. And I think that Turkish troops won't be needed here. And actually a big question is if NATO troops will be necessary. But clearly Turkish troops or Hungarian troops will not be needed here. Okay, what if this war grows into a world war? Where is Turkey's place? You see, Turkey is a member of NATO. Maybe the most important one, if we're talking about certain regions, or not so important when we're talking about Europe. So I really don't know why we focus on Turkey now. It's good that Turkey is a member of NATO and is an ally of Europe in this war, not an adversary. And I don't think that there are any complaints about Turkey's behavior when we talk about the war in Ukraine. NATO doesn't have problems with Turkey. I'd say there are more complaints about Hungary. The only problem with Turkey is that they're blocking Sweden's joining NATO. That creates a certain challenge, but this challenge is temporary. And I think right now it's more like a bureaucratic one, because Sweden and Finland decided to join NATO in order to protect themselves from Russian invasion. And let's be frank, that the fact itself that Sweden announced about its readiness to join NATO, and it can't join it because of the complications that Turkey created, is already enough to protect Sweden from Russian invasions. I don't think that, theoretically speaking, Russian invasion of Sweden is possible. And I don't think that they would consider this invasion as a non-NATO country attack. I'd say that NATO would protect Sweden. Maybe Turkey can influence Sweden in a certain way because of the dissidents, Turkish dissidents that are living in Sweden, and I don't know if Turkey will be able to resolve those issues with Sweden. But I don't think that now it's a factor, that it's an impeding factor that may cause Sweden being unprotected in case of a Russian invasion. I think there are many advantages of Turkey being a member of NATO. Now we witness the beginning of the war between Taliban and Iran, and a few minutes ago we were talking about how diverse is a group of Putin's allies, and it's a very good example of such diversity. On the one hand is the Taliban of Sunnis and Shias Iran, and both of them are Putin's allies. So what do you think would be the role of this conflict, and what position will be taken by a Russian KGB, Putin's regime? Let me put it this way. frankly, I'm not very much concerned about Iran, and I'm concerned about it only from the point of view of a possible support of Russia to Iran to finish their nuclear program, to get nuclear weapons, and have a potential conflict in the Middle East. Because if Putin decides to create conflictual points in the world, obviously undermining the Middle East is quite a significant threat for stability in the whole world, and particularly in Europe and the United States. Because if Iran will be allowed to create nuclear weapons, it will cause a preventive strike of Israel on Iran, and it may disrupt the Middle East. And from this point of view, I'm concerned about Iran, and I was concerned about it before. And regarding Taliban, Afghanistan, I have to say that sadly, Afghanistan is now crossed out from the list of countries that anybody has any plans for or is going to influence, because it's impossible to do. And then there is another question, the final one. We know that Putin is trying to rely on China's support in his policy. So what will China do if Putin allows himself such nuclear hooliganism? China did everything that it wanted to do already. And I think that Chinese policy and its position is quite provocative towards Russia. The same is Putin's policy towards Belarus is quite provocative. So China kind of plays the same game towards Russia. Because Putin, starting the war against Ukraine, obviously he isolated Russia from Europe, and this is his main crime. If we are talking about interests of Russian Federation, because every day of this war isolates Russia more and more from Europe, and for a longer decades, for more decades. If Belarus launches a nuclear strike on any European country, it will mean that Russia will be isolated from Europe for centuries. And this in turn will mean that in this situation Russia will become not just provincial of China, but will become China's subject, and China will devour Russia. That's why what Putin does today and what he is doing together with China, and of course it's a state crime. I mean, if we're talking about interests of Russia and Russia's state, of course Putin is a traitor and a state criminal. So Yuri, we're more than an hour on air, so thank you very much for this interview. We want to believe, you and I, that you're wrong. because this scenario is catastrophic. I would like to remind you that together with us there was Yuri Felshtinsky, historian and writer, and I am Daniil Konstantinov at the Free Russia Forum channel, so stay with us. Please like this video. We will get back to those topics, and we will have more interviews with Yuri Felshtinsky, and we will follow how the events will be unfolding. Thank you very much.